In March of 1952, a young French archaeologist named Henri de Contenson lowered himself into a shallow cave carved into the limestone cliffs on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. The cave was small, barely tall enough to crouch in. The dust was thick, the air dry, and the silence was absolute. De Contenson was part of a team racing against time and treasure hunters. 5 years earlier, a Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed edh-Dhib had stumbled into a cave not far from here while chasing a runaway goat. He threw a stone into the darkness and heard something shatter. Inside, he found tall clay jars filled with leather scrolls wrapped in linen cloth. Those scrolls turned out to be the most significant archaeological discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest copies of the Hebrew Bible ever found, some dating back more than 2,000 years. Since that day, archaeologists from half a dozen nations had been tearing through the cliffs above the ancient ruins of Qumran, prying open every crack in the rock. Cave after cave yielded treasures of text. Cave 1 held the great Isaiah scroll. Cave 4, the richest, produced fragments of nearly 600 manuscripts, prayers, prophecies, hymns, community rules, commentaries on the books of Moses. De Contenson expected Cave 3 to offer more of the same. A few parchment scraps, perhaps a clay jar, perhaps nothing. What he found instead was something no scholar in history had ever seen. Near the back wall, half buried in centuries of dust, lay 2 rolled cylinders of green metal. Not parchment, not leather, not papyrus. Copper. Pure, hammered copper, roughly 1 millimeter thick, green with 2,000 years of oxidation, and so brittle that if you tried to unroll them, they would crumble to powder in your hands. For 3 years, those copper cylinders sat in the Palestine Archaeological Museum in East Jerusalem, and nobody could read a single word. They were too fragile to touch, too corroded to flatten, too mysterious to ignore. But here is what nobody knew yet. Here is what would take another 3 years and a machine built in England to discover. Every other Dead Sea Scroll found in those caves, more than 900 of them, contained religious writing, prayers, prophecies, rules for ritual purity, copies of Genesis, Deuteronomy, Psalms, Isaiah. This scroll contained none of that. This scroll was a treasure map, 64 entries, 64 locations, and at each location, someone had buried gold, silver, sacred vessels, consecrated incense, and priestly garments, treasure so vast that modern estimates place its total value at more than $3 billion. This is not a story about archaeology. This is not a story about an old map in a museum. This is a story about a group of priests who knew their world was about to end, and what they chose to save in the final hours before the fire came. And at the end of certain entries on that copper map, someone carved 2 or 3 Greek letters into the metal. Nobody has been able to explain what those letters mean. Scholars have argued about them for 70 years. But there is one theory, and if it is right, it transforms the copper scroll from a treasure list into something far more sacred. Stay with me. To understand the copper scroll, you need to understand the war that was fought over who got to read it. The international team assembled to study the Dead Sea Scrolls was small, powerful, and slow. It was led by a Dominican priest named Roland de Vaux, the director of the École Biblique in Jerusalem, a French Catholic institution with deep ties to the Vatican. De Vaux assigned each cave's material to a specific scholar. The scrolls from Cave 3, including the copper cylinders, were assigned to a young Polish priest and epigrapher named Józef Milik. Milik was brilliant. He could read ancient Hebrew the way you read a grocery list, but he was also cautious to the point of paralysis. He studied, he deliberated, he waited. And while he waited, the copper rolls sat in a glass case, unreadable, and the world waited with them. This drove one man to fury. His name was John Marco Allegro. A British scholar from the University of Manchester, Allegro was the only member of the international team who was not a priest or a seminarian. He was an outsider, sharp-tongued, impatient, and suspicious that the scrolls were being kept from the public for religious reasons. He believed the copper rolls might contain something explosive, and he wanted them opened. Now, Allegro lobbied hard. He wrote letters. He gave press interviews that infuriated DeVoe. He pushed and pushed until, in 1955, he arranged for the 2 copper cylinders to be shipped from Jerusalem to the Manchester College of Technology, where a professor of mechanical engineering named Wright Baker agreed to attempt the impossible. Baker designed a small cutting machine, a tiny circular saw mounted on a precision track. Over several painstaking sessions in 1955 and 56, he sliced the 2 copper rolls into 23 curved strips. Each strip was photographed, cleaned, and catalogued. And for the first time in 2,000 years, human eyes could read the text. What Baker and Allegro saw stunned them both. There were no prayers, no psalms, no prophecy. The text read like a military inventory, a quartermaster's log of items buried at exact locations. Entry 1. In the ruin that is in the valley of Achor, under the steps heading east, at a distance of 40 cubits, a chest of silver and its vessels, total weight, 17 talents. Entry 4. In the large cistern that is within the court of the peristyle, in a recess in its floor, concealed by a sedimentary plug, 900 talents of silver. Entry after entry. Gold ingots, silver coins, tithing vessels, consecrated garments, jars of aromatics, sacred scrolls sealed in copper containers, 64 entries in total. And at the end of 7 of those entries, 2 or 3 Greek letters, Ken, the, HN, TR, carved into the copper with no explanation, as though the writer expected the reader to already know what they meant. Here is what most people miss. Allegro published his translation in 1960, a full 2 years before Milik released his official edition. Allegro's book, The Treasure of the Copper Scroll, made headlines around the world. He declared the treasure was real, and he believed he could find it. The academic establishment turned on him. Milik responded by publishing his own edition in 1962. His conclusion was the opposite. The treasure, Milik wrote, was imaginary, folklore, a fantasy dreamed up by the ascetic community at Qumran, men who had no wealth of their own and liked to imagine vast riches hidden under the desert. Milik called the numbers exaggerated beyond belief. The scholarly world sided with Milik. Allegro was discredited, mocked, and pushed to the margins of academia. He spent the rest of his career in the wilderness, convinced he was right and furious that no one would listen. But the question never went away, and 7 decades later, it still has not been settled. Was Milik right? And the treasure is a legend? Or was Allegro right? And somewhere under the hills of Judea, there is a fortune in sacred gold that no one has touched for 2,000 years. Let me pause here and tell you where we are. You are listening to the story of the most unusual document in the entire Dead Sea Scroll collection, a treasure map carved in copper listing 64 hiding places and a fortune worth more than $3 billion in today's money. If this is your first time hearing about the Copper Scroll, you are not alone. Most people have never been told this story. If you find this as remarkable as I think you do, take a moment to subscribe. This channel breaks down the most hidden corners of biblical history, the scrolls that were buried, the books that were removed, and the stories that were forgotten. And we are just getting started with this one. Now let me show you why the real treasure theory is far stronger than most people realize. The Copper Scroll lists a total of roughly 4,600 talents of gold and silver. One talent in the ancient Near East weighed approximately 75 pounds. You run those numbers, and you get about 350,000 pounds of precious metal. At today's market prices, that falls somewhere between $1 and $3 billion. Milik called those numbers absurd. No community, he said, could have accumulated that much wealth. But Milik was thinking of the wrong community. Pay attention to this. The scroll is not written in the same Hebrew as the other Dead Sea Scrolls. Every other scroll from Qumran uses a literary, archaic, biblical Hebrew, the formal language of scripture and scholarship. The Copper Scroll is written in Mishnaic Hebrew, the everyday spoken language of 1st century Judea, the language of markets and temple courts, the language you would hear if you walked through the streets of Jerusalem in the year 60. This matters more than you might think. It means the Copper Scroll was almost certainly not written by the Qumran community, the same group that produced the other scrolls. It was written by someone from the outside, someone connected to Jerusalem, someone connected to the temple. And the Hebrew words the scroll uses for its buried caches tell you something crucial. The primary word is Otsar, Aleph, Tzadi, Resh, and it does not mean treasure the way you imagine it. In English, treasure conjures images of pirate chests and golden coins, but Otsar comes from a root meaning to store up carefully, to set aside with intention. When Deuteronomy chapter 28 promises that God will open his good Otsar to bless the land with rain, the word means a storehouse, something prepared in advance for a purpose not yet arrived. And the scroll uses a second word, Matmon, from a root meaning to hide deliberately. When Job chapter 3 speaks of people who search for Matmon more eagerly than for silver, the word carries a specific weight. Matmon is not something lost. Matmon is not something forgotten. Matmon is what you bury when you intend for someone, the right person, at the right time, to find it again. But it gets stranger. Those two words together, Otsar and Matmon, paint a picture that does not match a pirate horde or a rebel war chest. This was not treasure stolen in the night. This was not plunder seized from the rich. This was not coins scraped together by desert monks. This was a sacred trust, property set aside by men who believed God would bring them back to reclaim it, and who in the 1st century had access to that kind of wealth. Not the ascetics at Qumran, not a desert sect living in poverty and ritual prayer. The Temple of Jerusalem. You need to understand how staggeringly wealthy the temple was. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian who personally witnessed the Roman siege, described the Temple of Herod as one of the richest buildings in the ancient world. Gold plating covered the entire eastern facade, so bright that Josephus wrote, "You could not look at it in the morning sun without turning your eyes away." Silver vessels filled the inner chambers. Tithes poured in from Jewish communities across the Roman Empire, from Babylon to Alexandria to Rome itself. 3 times a year, pilgrims by the hundreds of thousands brought offerings in gold and silver coin. For more than 500 years, wealth had been accumulating in the temple treasury, and the priests who managed that treasury, men who had spent their entire lives cataloging and protecting sacred objects, could see what was coming. The Jewish revolt against Rome began in the year 66. By 68, Vespasian's legions were burning their way through Galilee. By 69, Jerusalem was surrounded. The priests had years of warning, years to prepare, years to decide what to do. Here is the part nobody tells you. Josephus records that when the Romans finally broke through the temple walls in the summer of 70, they found enormous quantities of gold and silver. So much gold, he wrote, that the price of gold across the entire Roman province of Syria dropped by half after the looting. The Roman general Titus himself paraded the sacred menorah and the table of showbread through the streets of Rome in a triumphal procession. But Josephus also names a priest called Jesus, son of Thebuthus, who surrendered temple treasures to the Romans as a bargaining chip for his own survival. Candlesticks, tables, bowls, platters, priestly garments, and jars of cinnamon and cassia used in the daily incense offering. And here is the question that keeps archaeologists up at night. Was that everything? Was every last vessel, every coin, every sacred object still inside the temple when the Romans arrived? Or did the priests, men who had decades of warning and centuries of institutional memory, already remove the most sacred pieces from the city and bury them in the desert hills? The Copper Scroll says they did. Now watch what happens next. In 1967, a Baptist minister from Texas named Vendyl Jones read Allegro's translation of the Copper Scroll and felt something he could not shake. A conviction, a calling. He moved to Israel. He learned Hebrew. He studied the topography of the Judean wilderness, and he began to dig. Jones was not a trained archaeologist. The academic world dismissed him as a well-meaning amateur with a shovel and a dream. But Jones kept digging, year after year, decade after decade. In 1988, his team discovered a sealed clay juglet buried in a cave near the ruins of Qumran. Inside was a thick, reddish substance. When the Israel Antiquities Authority tested it, the results were remarkable. The substance contained balsam oil and a blend of spices consistent with the ancient recipe for the temple incense, the Decoded, described in the 30th chapter of Exodus. 11 ingredients, blended in exact proportions, offered twice a day on the golden altar in the holy place. It was not gold, it was not silver, but it was exactly the kind of sacred material described in the Copper Scroll, and it had been buried in exactly the kind of location the scroll described. Jones spent nearly 40 years searching the desert. He never found the main treasure. He died in 2010, still believing it was there, still believing someone would find it. But while Jones was digging in the Judean hills, a scholar at Johns Hopkins University named P. Kyle McCarter was solving the last great mystery of the scroll, those Greek letters. You remember them. 2 or 3 characters, carved at the end of 7 entries. No explanation, no context. For decades, every theory had failed. Code names, abbreviations of location names, random scribal marks. Nothing fit. And then McCarter proposed something no one had considered. The letters, he argued, were abbreviations of Greek names, not place names, not code words, the names of the priestly families who had buried the treasure at each location. Think about what that means for a moment. If McCarter is right, each entry on the copper scroll is not simply a treasure listing. It is a record of responsibility, a chain of custody, carved in copper. This family buried this gold at this location. This family is accountable for this silver. When the danger passes, when the temple is rebuilt, when God's people return, these families will go back to these locations and retrieve what they hid. These were not thieves. They were not looters grabbing what they could carry. They were not rebels stashing funds for a future war. They were guardians, men who believed they were preserving the holiest objects on earth from destruction, and who fully expected to come back for them. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearable to hold. If you have ever been to Rome, you may have walked through the ancient Forum and passed beneath the Arch of Titus, a white marble arch still standing after nearly 2,000 years. On its inner walls, carved in deep stone relief, you can see Roman soldiers carrying the great seven-branched menorah on their shoulders, a trophy of war, a monument to total conquest. The Emperor Domitian built that arch to celebrate what Rome took from the temple. But the copper scroll is the record of what the priests tried to save. Two documents, two sides of the same catastrophe, one carved in marble, displayed in the heart of an empire for the world to admire. The other carved in copper, rolled tight and hidden in a cave at the edge of the desert, waiting for someone to come back and finish what was started. No one ever came back. The temple was never rebuilt. The priestly families scattered across the Roman world. And the treasure, if it still lies in those cisterns and caves and buried tombs, has been waiting in silence for 2,000 years. Billions of dollars in gold and silver, buried by men who believed they would return within months, within a year, within a generation at the most. They have been waiting for 20 centuries, and the copper map they left behind is still the only voice they have. So what do you carry with you from a story like this? 3 things. First, the copper scroll is real. It is not a forgery. It is not folklore. It is a genuine first-century document, written in a dialect of Hebrew that links it to the temple priesthood, inscribed on copper so it would survive what parchment could not. Whether the treasure itself still exists is an open question, but the scroll is authentic, and its contents are too specific, too detailed, and too consistent with what we know about the temple treasury to be dismissed as a dead man's fantasy. Second, the copper scroll changes how you see the fall of Jerusalem. You have heard the story of destruction, the fire, the legions, the exile, but the copper scroll tells you there was another story happening at the same time. A quieter story. Priests moving through the hills at night, carrying sacred vessels wrapped in linen, lowering them into cisterns and caves and tombs, then carving a map into copper, because copper does not rot, copper does not burn, and copper lasts long enough for your great-grandchildren to find their way back to what you buried. And third, this is the one that stays with you. The copper scroll may be the most expensive act of faith ever recorded. Every entry on that scroll is a promise. Every set of directions is a prayer. We are coming back. We will rebuild. We will need these again. They carved that promise into metal because they believed it with everything they had. They never came back. But the scroll survived. And 2,000 years later, you are hearing their story. You are the person who finally came back to the cave and read the map. Here is my question for you, and I genuinely want to know your answer. If you were one of those priests, standing in the corridors of the temple with Roman siege engines already hammering the outer wall, what would you save? What single object, what one sacred thing would you risk your life to carry into the desert and bury? Tell me in the comments. And if this story moved you, share it with one person who has never heard of the Copper Scroll. I promise you, they will thank you. Until next time.